Hi, and welcome to Homoludens, the channel on history and board games. I would like to welcome everyone for this night's stream. I can see that there is already quite a lot of you in the chat, so that's really great. Just for information, we have 2 additional moderators for tonight's stream. So I would recommend that you have open-minded and polite conversation. We'll be happy to bring questions from the community in the chat, so feel free to do this, ask questions, and I will bring them in when I think makes sense in the conversation. I would like to thank our 2 moderators, Olivier and Liz, for taking the time. That's really nice from them. And thank my guests, but we'll come back to the guests later. Before we begin, I wanted to set the stage for today's discussion, as I've seen a lot of misrepresentation of this discussion online before we actually did this stream. Just to clarify my position on what we're going to discuss today, I personally believe that board games are a very powerful medium that are capable of exploring complex and difficult subjects. So I'm not questioning that. And I think that includes playing the bad guys and covering really hard topics. For those people who think that I have an issue with that, I would recommend just looking at my stream of videos. You will see that I've played the Germans in World War II. I've played the British Empire during decolonization. So just look at what we do. We've done a full series on the British way, which is a pretty rough topic. And I think if you have any doubt, you should just be more informed or question the people who say those kind of things. So no intentions. I don't even question the intention of the designer of the other side of the hill, Carlos, with whom I've had multiple very constructive discussions. My focus here is on discussing how these historical games are crafted and the responsibility that we bear in their creation, but also in the way we play them. We're not calling for any games to be banned. This is not really the kind of vibe that we have here. We don't ban stuff. This is not this side of the political spectrum. We just want to examine the way in which we portray history in the games that we love. And if you also love this hobby, I think that you probably should too. Just to clarify why we're having this stream tonight, I was set aback when I saw that Not Wargames was distributing Nazi-era Iron Crosses that were a reproduction of the 1939 Iron Cross as a promotional material that was distributed in Germany during the Essen Convention, which struck me as very insensitive, especially as it was coming with a game that prides itself in being very careful in the way it's covering its theme. And I think there was a big dissonance between Carlos's work and what the publisher was pushing in terms of promotional material. This act, alongside the game's ambition to delve into the Nazi regime's inner working, I think calls for a deep and careful examination of the kind of message that we're sending in our community and beyond. And this has been seen by people outside of the wargaming community. And I think a lot of the reaction from the wargaming community that was have those knee-jerk reaction in defending it and not trying to examine potentially the issue, reflected pretty poorly on our community as a whole. And I think it's probably also a subject for discussion. For these reasons, I decided to regroup this panel as early as possible to create a space where we can actually have a serious conversation on this topic. And I would like to thank them for taking the time to speak together and have a really challenging conversation, especially as the minds are a bit hot right now around this topic in an environment where there is a lot of hostility and defensiveness. So I really hope that we can foster a thoughtful dialogue tonight. And let's have a look at our guest. So we have with us Jan, and maybe I will ask each of you to have a quick word of presentation. And we're going to start with you, Jan. You haven't been on the show for a while, but for the OGs of Homoludens, they will recognize Jan that has been here quite a few times in the past. Can you maybe briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a historian and political scientist, specialized on historical game studies, which will be relevant today for the discussion. And I'm also one of the staff members at the International Kriegsspiel Society and a wargaming practitioner.
Great. Volko, I think that a big part of the audience will know you, but I think that if there are people who are not wargamers that are listening in, I think it would be nice to present yourself too.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Volko Ruhnke. I am a retired U.S. federal government analyst, and I'm also a published hobby historical board game designer going back about a quarter century, mostly publishing via GMT Games.
Great. And Mr. Whitman Bjorn, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Wehrmacht born. I'm a associate professor of history at Northumbria University here in the UK. My focus is on the Holocaust, but my first book and a lot of my work was focused on the Wehrmacht and its role in the Holocaust. Also love board games. I love computer games as well. Just happy to be here, and it's going to be fun to have this conversation.
Great. And finally, Alastair, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alastair Kocho Williams. I'm a professor of history at Clarkson University in northern New York. I'm a historian of early Soviet and late Russian imperial foreign policy in the main, but a lot of my teaching involves the use of war games to teach about particularly the world wars, and I also teach wargaming design here, which is very popular with students.
Yeah, that's great. And I must say that for those who don't follow Alastair on Twitter, I know that a lot of designers are following your thread and your account, and or trolling appearing. So I know that I could see one of my games being exposed in your class. Super excited. Very nice. Have issues, or is it just me? Nope. Can you hear me?
Yep. I think the issues are on your end.
Yeah. I thought I had a connection. Start conversation. I thought it would be nice to start with a clear going to be at the core of this discussion, and that's the clean Wehrmacht myth, which has significantly shaped the perception post-World War II of the war and the involvement of the Wehrmacht, especially in the Holocaust and other war crimes. And because we have a specialist with us, I was wondering, Whitman, if you could actually give us an overview of what was the clean Wehrmacht myth, and what does it entail, and how can we recognize it if we need to spot it?
Sure, and thanks so much, Fred, for having me on. I'm really happy to be here, and it's great to meet Alastair in sort of more personal situations, because I really love his thread, and I really wish I could take his class. It's amazing. Yeah, so let me give a little overview of sort of where this idea of the clean Wehrmacht comes from. It's a myth that is created almost at the same time as the end of the Second World War. Excuse me. And so I think, first of all, the thing that I want to just highlight is that the Wehrmacht, and whether we use sort of the most inclusive definition there, which is Luftwaffe, Heer, Kriegsmarine, and everything else, or if we're just talking about the army, it is a weapon of mass destruction. It's a genocidal tool of the Nazi state. It is deeply complicit in a massive number of areas in what I call the Nazi genocidal project, from assisting the Einsatzgruppe in mass shootings, to participating in those mass shootings themselves, to murdering Jews on its own, often in the context of the anti-partisan war, so-called, to the use of slave labor in armaments industries, and in the case of the German army, for example, in carrying out literally its own genocide, which is the genocide of Soviet prisoners of war, of whom 3.3 million die in Wehrmacht captivity, and that's intentional. Along with the Wehrmacht's role in despoiling the East, it's emptying insane asylums and murdering handicapped and emotionally and mentally and physically handicapped people, et cetera, et cetera. This is all deeply documented in German army archival documents, testimonies, everything else. So I'm not going to adjudicate that here. I'm just going to sort of put that out there as fact. And there's lots and lots of sources, and I'm happy to sort of provide those in the course of the conversation if anybody's interested. The myth itself, I'll just define it very quickly. The myth itself is this idea that the German army in particular, but also the German military writ large of the Third Reich, was basically just fighting a conventional war, your standard sort of soldier on soldier battle, had nothing to do with the Nazi state in terms of the Nazi racial policy or the Holocaust or any of the genocidal actions of the Third Reich. It was completely separate from that. It was just fighting a war, which was actually a really good thing because it's fighting against the Soviets. And look what the Soviets did when the Red Army comes into Germany in 1945 with its mass rape of German women, et cetera, et cetera. This myth is helped not a little bit by the Allies themselves. At the Nuremberg trials, the SS is termed a criminal organization, but the Wehrmacht is not, meaning that simple membership in the SS made one a war criminal. However, membership in the Wehrmacht did not, though there were some high-ranking generals prosecuted. Prosecutions of Wehrmacht officers and men were very, very rare. Secondly, the myth is created again with the sort of complicity of the Allies, because what particularly the Americans do is invite a lot of former Wehrmacht generals to come over to the United States, tell us all about what it's like to fight the Russians, because they're the most recent people to have fought the Soviets, and so their feedback in that sense is very important. And so the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army history groups and other people allow them to essentially craft the narrative of the Second World War. And naturally, they quite happy to leave out all of the ways in which they're complicit in the Third Reich's genocides. And so this sort of creates a foundation. Then politically speaking, in the 1950s and 60s, there is a drive between the Americans, the British, and the Germans to sort of recognize that now the Germans are actually allies in this Cold War against the Russians. And so there's even more of a push to kind of sweep under the carpet the crimes of the Wehrmacht and the extent of those crimes in the interests of sort of good cooperation between allies. And this is a phenomenon that goes all the way up into the 90s, I would argue. And it makes sense to a certain extent, because it's one thing to say that the SS were war criminals and were, responsible for the Holocaust and genocide, because relatively speaking, the SS had a small membership. However, 17 million men and 500,000 German women served in the Wehrmacht at some point during the war. And so that's a lot of fathers, brothers, uncles, etc. And if you start throwing around, the words that they're war criminals, then that ruffles a lot more feathers, I would argue, than sort of just blaming on the SS. In the late 90s, in the mid 90s. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe a good example of that, just to exemplify. Do you think that, for example, a figure like Adolf Hitler, who was the head of NATO for a time, is actually a good example of like making this clean distinction? Like, he was part of the OKH during the war. He was a high-ranking Wehrmacht official, but at the same time, in the early 60s, he was also he was the head of NATO. So there was clearly like a bit of a weird lines that were being crossed, right, at this time.
Well, yeah, I mean, the challenge is one that any sort of occupying force or occupying country deals with, which is that on the one hand, denazification was an attempt to remove people who had been Nazis from positions of authority in Germany after the war, but you can't throw everybody out, particularly when you have this new threat of the Soviet Union and you need a German military, a Bundeswehr, that's functional. And so there is a search through the sort of people who aren't deeply connected to the Nazi state in the Wehrmacht for usable people that can fulfill a role in the Bundeswehr and draw on their previous military and leadership experience. And of course, ironically, just like a couple of months ago, the Bundeswehr has reversed itself and is now basically saying that it's okay to memorialize, to commemorate, and sort of honor people who served in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War, which is a thing it hadn't been doing before, and now it's decided that's okay. So this creates and I'm gonna finish because I want everybody else to have a chance to talk. But this in the 90s, there is a very famous Wehrmacht exhibition that travels Germany, and for the first time really confronts ordinary Germans with the complicity of the Wehrmacht in letters and diaries and photographs in a way that, excuse me, that they hadn't been before. Just literally undeniable evidence that not only were Wehrmacht veterans and soldiers there, they were participating, sometimes willingly, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a myth that is then also perpetuated in things like there's a series of books called Panzer Aces. I think it's Franz Kurowski is the author, and they're basically sort of military porn about how amazing the Wehrmacht is, without any sort of recognition of the larger scope. So it's just tank battles and amazing tank battles of the Wehrmacht against overwhelming odds being successful in these kinds of things. And then in movies and film, Cross of Iron by Sam Peckinpah is a good example. Even the Vilsmeier Stalingrad film has its own issues in kind of perpetuating that really it's the mean Prussian Nazified officers and the rank and file were innocent. And all these things together sort of perpetuate this idea that you can separate a perceived, and again, I say perceived because one of the things that I did before I became an academic was I was a military officer, and I went to West Point for my undergraduate education, and I was an officer in the United States Army. And one of the things that is perceived in the Wehrmacht is that it was this amazing fighting force, when in fact it's not. I mean, in some ways it's successful in lots of ways, but ultimately it isn't. It's only 10% mechanized at its greatest moment. It makes terrible decisions on the daily, but there is a sense, and gets back to, and I'm going to close here, but this gets back to kind of Fred's initial last part of his brief for me, which was, how do you recognize that you're seeing someone who is kind of perpetuating this myth? And we kind of call them like the rivet counters, people that are very obsessed with how amazing the Wehrmacht is militarily and sort of how successful it is. And again, this is all contestable from a military historical point of view, but people who just love tanks and they love watching this stuff, and that's not always a bad thing, but it very quickly can be seen. And I saw this today on my Twitter feed, where somebody was saying, well, the rank and file weren't Nazis and they weren't really involved in the Holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just fundamentally not true. And so again, I'll close it there, but this is something that we see it happens all the time, and it happens a lot in sort of the popular cultural world, in the world of reenacting is a place that I see it quite a bit. And anybody who sort of follows me on Twitter has probably seen me, talking about the problems of reenacting, which I think, by the way, is a different issue than what we're going to talk about tonight, because I'm also not sort of nobody should play war games and nobody should ever have these encounters. I just think what we'll probably think about tonight is, how do we have these encounters in a thoughtful way that recognizes and doesn't glorify an army that fought to advance a genocidal state's routine. And I will close with this, which is that I myself in some ways am a recovering Wehraboo. When I was a cadet at West Point, we were all into a thing called Micro Armor, which is like this. It's a tabletop game with like little pewter tanks, and I like anybody else, I wanted to be the Germans, and I like the Panzers are really cool, et cetera, et cetera. This is a problem in the U.S. military in a sort of memory sense as well. So I mean, I understand sort of where people are coming from. I just think that you can go too far overboard in terms of idolizing with that. And I would say the same thing, by the way, about the Confederacy and lots of other problematic organizations. But maybe I should stop here and be quiet
and I think
let
it's
the experts talk.
I think it's a great overview, and thanks a lot for that. And it's good that you highlight that you yourself were attracted by some aspects of the myth, and I think it's a very appealing one. And we also have this natural tendency to support the underdog. So I think it works for the American Civil War, it works for Germany after 41. So I think we can address the fact that, okay, it's not dirty to have those thoughts, but it's good to examine them, I would say. But now to open up to wargaming specifically, and here I will look to you, Volko, because not to be offensive, but it looks like you are probably the one who's been playing war games the longer out of all of us. And I was wondering, from your perspective, how do you feel like this clean Wehrmacht way of seeing the war has impacted the way the war was portrayed in wargame design, especially in the early days? And we can think about, there was a lot of controversies regarding the ASL cover, the first one, but there is also also this heroification of generals like Guderian, von Manstein, all of those things. But do you see it as a broader thing that went through all of the, like, that is really big into wargaming?
Yeah, I actually don't think I have special insight into how and to what degree the clean Wehrmacht myth found its way into board wargaming. So it might be someone else here on this panel, because I suspect everyone else here could do that probably better than me, ought to maybe establish that fact and the parameters of it. And you just now gave a couple of examples. I don't disbelieve it. I'm not sure that I know enough to opine about what happened. And instead, I guess what I do know from creating historical simulation board games and war games in particular is that you always focus on something. You always leave a lot of things out. You tend to follow traditions of what's been done before and what people have been interested in. And so when I look at the hobby war game industry and community from the 1950s in the United States to now, so that's what I see. And so probably I'm best to respond to the contention, I guess, that the reason war games in the 1970s, you mentioned Squad Leader, were the way they were, the contention that that's because of a myth about the Wehrmacht that came from elsewhere, as opposed to just the tradition of interest and the nature of modeling. There's a great essay by Dan Thoreau, Space Biff, and it's linked from my article on the Board Games Chronicle about The Other Side of the Hill, that has to do with the importance of scope in assessing a game's treatment of something. If we're going to assess it, including ethically, what is the game purporting to do? What is its scope? And I think, Waitman, you said that, being interested in tanks is not always bad. And it might be that a particular game's, its scope, its focus is on tank combat. And so it's not going to be about Einsatzgruppen because it's about tanks. And that may or may not be okay, but we consider that. My sense in the Avalon Hill, SPI, and the whole tradition is some of that the topics that they were war games came out of the defense world and the defense consulting world and Rand Corporation, which was interested in how do we militarily, engage the Soviets and what can we learn about it, as you mentioned. And so they war gamed military stuff, perhaps more than political or economic or cultural or information, whatever other realms of conflict. They were military games. And the recent big experience that seemed to offer the most lessons at the time in the 1950s was World War II. And so they're looking at the big war with Germany. And so you get a tradition then in hobby war games of very tightly focused military simulations rather than military, political, etc. And then, when resources are brought in, when we have, resource points in Third Reich in the 1970s, then that becomes, we've got an economic aspect. Well, that's really interesting. I've tried in my career to bring in, when I say career, I mean my, hobby game designs. I've tried to bring in political aspects because we all know war and politics are so tightly interwoven that if you transcend a focus on just military technical aspects, you get a better model of history. And I thought we needed more of that in games. But until we get to that, it's difficult for me to kind of assess, well, the fact that we just have, players playing Germany doing military things, or German forces doing military things against Allied forces, is that trying to say something, or is that simply the scope and the purpose of the game out of tradition? So I don't think that's the whole answer. It's just, I probably am not the right person to venture on.
So
here's
I think
here's
there
the
is
myth in the
form.
Yeah.
When I think about it, I think we can take maybe 3 specific examples that I think might be good ways to reveal how the myth has permeated in wargame design. I think the first one is, until pretty recently, when you look at the order of battles of Barbarossa campaign games, the level of mechanization that you see in the order of battles is very high. The quality of the troops at the beginning of in 41 is excellent for the German, extremely bad for the Soviets. So that's the first thing, like the way the actual armies are being portrayed. The second thing that I see is that I see a lot of games that have been released over the years, especially before the 2000s, where you had on the cover specifically German generals in the name of the game. And this was it's a big thing. Like it's not necessarily glorifying the generals, but I mean, it's putting them front and center. And then the third thing that I would see, and that's probably something to discuss, is that, okay, it focuses specifically on the military and operational aspects, so it makes sense to not talk about politics. But if you think about specific military problems, some aspects are not covered, like anti-partisan warfare is often not really looked at, but it was a big part of the Wehrmacht activity on the Eastern Front. And this is something that is usually glossed over by most designs. So could we agree that those are 3 things that we can observe in most of our tabletop wargaming, and that those are good examples of potentially the clean Wehrmacht myth permeating into our hobby?
I'm skeptical of the third one.
Maybe
no,
Jan, I see you nodding. So
agree.
Yeah,
so you don't agree? You don't agree with any of them, or just one of them, or do you have any?
The third one in particular. This is a good example. This is a good. Am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think the third one about leaving partisan warfare out is a good example of the nature of models that I was referring to. And so I do not agree, or I could be convinced perhaps, but just based on the example, that the absence of partisan warfare in a lot of games, it's in some, but in a lot of games is evidence of a clean Wehrmacht myth, because partisan warfare might have been less clean. Logistics were left out of most games. Command limitations, command span, staff tax was left out of most games. Even resources and economics were rarely appearing in games. And it's easily explained by the nature of the need to focus your game on something. And the most exciting thing is seeing movement across the map, or the illusion of motion, as Richard Berg put it. So if we if we are looking at the traditions of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s in wargaming, we can point to, or at least I've just tried to point to, many aspects of conventional warfare in Europe that were not included, but are very, very important to how it worked and what its outcomes were. So really, I was addressing the partisans part.
Okay, but for the rest, would you agree, or you feel that's unfair?
So one of the other ones, I think the first one, the technical depiction of the Wehrmacht as very effective. Yes, I think that you get, I do think you get too much of that early on, and a kind of a denigration of the capabilities of Russian soldiers and American soldiers, for example. And that might be, but it seems to me the less interesting part of the myth than what we have been talking about the Wehrmacht's involvement in the genocide, right? And that okay, so we puffed up the enemy we beat, perhaps to make it seem greater that we beat them. I don't know, or maybe, and again, I don't know. I'm not saying it's not true, but it might be to get the Wehrmacht to achieve what it did actually achieve in 1941 against the Soviets. You have to make the Wehrmacht better than the Soviets in the model in 1941 to get that result, right? You want to have plausible historical results. And to get the advances, perhaps you needed to make the Wehrmacht more mobile or harder hitting or something, or the Soviets less so. So I guess I am also looking at alternative explanations that have to do with simulation. And then on the covers, yeah, I think there is something to that it takes until the mid-70s to see Soviets represented on the covers. I think Roger McGowan's Russian campaign was the first one to have both sides shown, and well past that, you get a behavior by the publishers and the artists that suggests they think the market is going to be more interested in the depiction of the Germans and the German side in World War II than the Allies. So I do think there is something to that. Again, does that have to do with clean Wehrmacht and the idea that there's this, this German military that was not the Nazis and not participating in the Holocaust, which is the kind of the main consequential point we're talking about. I'm not sure that seems like an indirect hint of that kind of sentiment, but it's possible.
So I would like to maybe open the discussion to you, maybe Jan, to start with. So when we've defined what is the clean Wehrmacht, where it comes from, we've Weidman explained how it informed most of the way that the World War II, especially on this front, was seen. But when we talk about wargaming specifically, Volko only sees functional reasons for appearance of what looks like clean Wehrmacht things, but not the influence of the clean Wehrmacht itself. Maybe for you, from a German perspective, do you see that there is potentially something of a contradiction here, or what is your perspective on the influence of clean Wehrmacht on wargame design?
Yeah, I would think it's the other side of the medal, right? I think Volko is right in the point he's making, but the point I would counter with is that because the clean Wehrmacht is there from the beginning, it is perpetuated by the ways the Wehrmacht is portrayed in wargaming for most of the time. And that is, as you said, by iconography that goes even beyond the cover, showing tanks and generals and soldiers and so forth. But we still also have the iconography, as we legally call them in Germany, anti-constitutional symbols on units. We have SS units, which in most cases appear to be black counters because they are so special. We have the silhouette of the Tiger tank and all that stuff, which sort of becomes an issue not in itself, but because there is a memory culture around that focuses so much on these sort of one-sided aspects of the history that is portrayed, right? And my argument then also would be in opposition to Volko that if the goal would be to deliver a model, an accurate model, whatever that might be, aspects that are fundamentally part of military strategy must be part of that model. And as we have heard in the introduction, I mean, genocidal annihilation warfare and all the practices connected to it were a core part. And that's not only true for the Second World War. I was recently looking at a game Higher Safari, which is about the German colonial forces in East Africa, right? And the game is a classical hex and counter war game. And all it does is you're pushing units across the map and you're doing conventional kinetic warfare. But the core, the most important strategic strategy, the military strategy of the German forces in East Africa was annihilation warfare, genocidal warfare against the population, in order to prevent the British forces, the Entente forces, to benefit from them, from the infrastructure, from the resources, from the supply, from the manpower they could provide. And if that's not part of the game, then the model isn't really accurate in the first place, is it?
So your point is that in the framing itself, you can have erasure. So it's not even in the way it's representing. It's just the fact that it's decided to focus on something that is maybe not even the key aspect of a conflict. Maybe opening up to you, Alastair, now. So you're both an historian, a gamer, but also someone who uses war games into the classroom. What is your perspective on all this, on the depiction of the Eastern Front in general, and maybe its evolution over time?
Well, yeah, I think it's an important question to ask, and I think one of the sort of things where I would sort of come into this is talking about what a war game is and what it's doing, and that in many ways war games themselves are part of a historical discussion, perhaps not necessarily a very traditional academic one, but part of a sort of mainstream discussion, at least with a sector of the public, and I think to some extent, therefore, games sort of reflect what is the cultural and sort of historical discussion at a certain point at which they come out and which they're produced. And I think that's why games have evolved over time. And we're looking at games that existed in the 70s, perhaps look quite different to the games that are coming out now. And I think it's important that these games kind of increasingly we're having conversations about the questions that they're posing and the questions that they answer. I think kind of when we look at the evolution of these war games, it's always with students sort of saying, well, what people thought in the 1970s is not necessarily what people think in 2024, and that does matter. So always the date of a source matters. How much did we know? What was the dominant conversation? But I think sort of striking me in talking about this with the clean Wehrmacht sort of myth actually is if we look at sort of 1975, Susan Sontag writes an essay in the New York Review of Books called Fascinating Fascism, in which she starts to talk about the sort of fantasies of Nazism and the way in which there's all these sorts of sort of fantasy elements. People are getting very interested. Leni Riefenstahl has a book out which Sontag is reviewing. And one of the things that Susan Sontag says, I don't know how much she actually knew about wargaming, is that for a fantasy to have allure, it needs to be detailed. And I think that then sort of brings us into where the conversation with war games comes, because where's the detail? What is the focus of the detail? And I would tend to agree with what Volko has said about how when sort of we look at things from the 70s and possibly into the 80s, a lot of the focus here is looking at Germany as a military power, partly because you're looking for an explanation as to how they fought the Soviets. I think, though, kind of at the same time, and a lot of people, said this online, there is a sort of trend of Germany was actually quite successful initially until Barbarossa is derailed. That sort of blitzkrieg warfare looks incredibly exciting, and we can't talk about the Eastern Front without talking about armor. Of course, some of that blitzkrieg is mythologized, quite notably by Little Heart, who wrote the game that kind of prompted some of this discussion, or the promotional materials that went with it. The Other Side of the Hill, that's Little Heart's book title. And Little Heart, before he publishes that, is actually trying to claim that actually he's almost one of the theoreticians that led to blitzkrieg. And so I think there is sort of an explanation of trying to look at this style of warfare. And I think there's sort of an allure of the Cold War, of sort of the Soviet Union are the enemy. Who's fighting the Soviet Union here? Well, it's the Germans. But in the sort of Western explanation around what's going on in the Cold War. The Soviet Union are the enemy. And the Soviet Union are not even unproblematic, even in World War II. I mean, they're problematic in and of themselves. There's lots of conversations to be had there, I think, as well about how games handle them as a topic. But I think there is sort of, by and large, a sort of sanitized version of the Wehrmacht that appears, which, I mean, kind of interestingly, that the clean Wehrmacht, the Sauber, almost the verb there, that is sort of running as a current through a lot of games. And I think a lot of gamers are interested in things and then sort of able to sort of make peace with themselves that this isn't really about the horrors of the Nazis, because we're just fighting a war here. This is sort of, brings us back into the clean Wehrmacht myth that this is a conventional war. I think Volko has a lot of good to say, though, with what are you trying to model, and how do you model certain things. I think there are games that it's hard to model the commission of atrocities when you're trying to model combat, and so how far are you going with sort of modeling an entire war, I think matters. But I think games have started to shift to be a bit more critically, but I think there is always a question of ethics. And I think what a game is modeling. I guess another game that puts people in the position of Nazis working against the regime is the game Black Orchestra, where the aim is you want to kill Hitler, but ultimately you have to contend with the fact that you're all fairly senior members of the Nazi movement, and there is this sort of, I guess, moral question of the greater or lesser evil. But there are, I think, comfort zones, how comfortable people are with some of these things, and I think that comes down to a personal choice that needs to be sort of informed by things. But there are other games, I think, that have sought to model things, raising the questions sort of how much did people really know? And I think probably the best example there is Brenda Romero's Train, which and some people say, well, it's an incredibly deceptive game. Well, it's not if you're paying attention, because you break a pane of glass at the beginning. There's a typewriter with the S is replaced with an SS rune. It is literally there for you to figure it out if you pay attention. And I think that's part of her point. I think the clean Wehrmacht becomes kind of dangerous as a legitimizer. But I think it's important that we do have games that are what are games for? Well, they help us unpick things. And I think games can really help us navigate some of these hard ethical questions as well. And I think I haven't played The Other Side of the Hill. It's certainly an interesting concept, but I think there is the sort of question about playing a game to see how does it come out, what does it tell you, and perhaps exploring whether the model works or whether what happened historically is not necessarily an inevitability.
Oh, yeah, but thanks, Alastair, for adding that context. I just wanted to maybe go back into the direction of specifically the issue regarding the tension that we have between conflating commemoration and history, and all the tension that there is around this, and go back to the story of the whole thing that started this. So the medal. So as you know, there was this 1939 Iron Cross medal that was made by Wargames, replaced the swastika symbol by the logo of the publisher, and was available for Kickstarter backers at Essen in Germany, which is something that made me react. I think a lot of people on online reacted to this, saying, "Well, that's pretty insensitive and a bit weird." And I wanted to start maybe with you, Jan, from your perspective, because I think in a lot of ways you're one of the most concerned by this. You're a German living in Germany, and I wanted maybe to have your reaction and maybe your cultural perspective around seeing something like this. How does it feel to have this kind of imagery and this kind of memorabilia made just for a board game promotion?
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult subject still in Germany. I think the overall commemorative consensus is that this would be an outrageous thing to do. Now, there are so many different aspects to it. I mean, the clean Wehrmacht myth is still a thing in Germany, obviously, as it is everywhere else. But at the same time, there is, especially in the gaming world, I would say, and that is ironically the case more so in the digital gaming sphere than in the board gaming sphere, because the debate we're having today that happened in the digital sphere just a few years ago. There is a shift to see games as much more capable tool, as Volko and Alastair mentioned, to tackle difficult topics. And when it comes to the depiction of Nazi symbology and objects, there's of course the legal aspect in Germany, because reproducing Nazi symbology, and that includes the swastika, the SS runes, different division insignia, and so forth, the fascist greeting and all that stuff. That is considered anti-constitutional and would be a crime to be reproduced, at least if that's the case in Germany, like if it's distributed and reproduced in Germany. Also, an interesting aspect that was much more sort of awareness about that in the digital world. Lots of great big publishers either didn't publish in Germany or modified their games for a German version, deleting all the potentially problematic aspects. Even though games from a purely legal standpoint would be an exception to the law, right? Because there's the social adequacy paragraph which says you are allowed to reproduce these symbols and insignias and so forth in the context of art and education, if you are not trying to promote fascist or Nazi ideology, of course. There was a lot of insecurity about that, and we had a few years ago a discussion about that in the context of games who had a clearly anti-fascist objective, and a sort of historical, political, educational approach about what happened in the war, and did not limit themselves to just military kinetic warfare. And then things shifted, and now sort of digital games are also allowed to use them. But the majority of games, as I said, which focus purely on kinetic warfare and so forth, they are still, and they would still fall under legal restrictions, so they avoid it. Now, the interesting thing I mentioned earlier is that most of the games, the war games, as they came from the US and the UK, they didn't have these laws, right? So they were produced with anti-constitutional symbols, and those could be imported no problem, because nobody was really taking care of that, unless they were actually used and exploited in a neo-fascist context. Getting back to the medal as a sort of merchandise gimmick, I think is sort of, from my perspective, highly problematic, because it very clearly cannot be seen as the military medal that has been given out from 1813 onwards, because it's very clearly in the design, or as it was issued from 1939 onwards, as part of the military apparatus. And also for political reasons, as we have heard in the introduction by Weidman, and is like fundamentally connected to the genocide and the crimes of the Nazis. So handing that out as just a gimmick is problematic. It's not legally relevant because, as you said, it has replaced the anti-constitutional symbols, but that's ethically very strange thing, especially when you claim that your game is actually trying to debunk the clean Wehrmacht myth.
And if I could just jump in really quick, also,
Yeah.
I think one of the issues, and this is speaking more, I guess, to some of the digital computer games, because I agree completely with what Volko said earlier. You know, like if it's a tank on tank game, I mean, I don't know how you really put in the Holocaust, or I mean, you know, it's top trumps of tanks and who wins and all that, and that's, you know, whatever, in some sense, good clean fun. But I also think sometimes one of the challenges is these kinds of things create the environment. And I can't tell you, when I was playing World of Tanks and the other one, how many times you come across somebody who is like, you know, Waffen SS 88 username, you know, or like another even more inappropriate username, you know, who is finding this to be a space that's comforting for them to embrace these kinds of you know, really problematic belief systems. And again, that's not necessarily the designer's fault, though. Looking at the preview for this, the Hearts of Iron add-on, which I also admittedly haven't played, I mean, that was crazy to me. I mean, because the designers have literally said they have a person on there saying, "Hooray, Nazis! We're going to go out and conquer the world," et cetera, et cetera. You know, and I think there is something deeply problematic about that, and I think I don't think there is a sort of compelling human rights need to portray everything in a game. And one of the things, ironically, I think, as these games have gotten more complex, like this Hearts of Iron that engages with, because I have played Hearts of Iron, just not that mod, you know, that have, you know, political, social, cultural, economic aspects. As they become more complex, in some ways, they're actually opening a Pandora's box of, you know, am I going to now consider how best to design my slave labor so that it helps me to win, you know, and then what is at stake if we are now asking people or offering people the opportunity to make these kinds of decisions? And one of the questions that ironically often comes up, you know, when I'm talking in public or some places, sometimes people will say, you know, what could the Nazis have done to win the Second World War? And I'm always thinking, that's a really weird question, because why are you fantasizing about what the Nazis could have done to win? And I mean, I get that that's often an innocuous question. I'm not suggesting everyone who asks that question is a Nazi by any stretch. But I do think there is something about the way that some people approach the playing or embodying of the Wehrmacht and or the Nazis in a way that they're able to separate from the rest of it, that I just think is a bit problematic. And I think it gets even worse when you're talking about sort of the first person shooters where you can be a German. Or, I mean, you know, I don't think that's necessary for any reason whatsoever. I take Alistair's point very well. You know, I think when you're talking about a simulation where you're trying to think about how did something happen historically and why might it have happened historically, there's obviously compelling reasons to have the quote bad guys. And in fact, when I was in the US, when I was teaching a class in comparative genocide, I actually took a game model that the University of Georgetown, when it's training foreign service officers, uses, where I basically constructed a fictional genocide in a fictional country and had students play the various roles of NGOs and government actors, et cetera. I think those kinds of simulations are incredibly important and can be really useful. I don't think, as we drift closer and closer to sort of fun entertainment, I think there is some responsibility for designers to think about the messages, either explicit or implicit, that are being disseminated by those systems.
Yeah. Can I just
And
add
I would like to
cautionary note?
Yeah.
On the metal. Yeah, thanks. You know, I think it's fair to look at the object and know the audience that might see it and conclude insensitive, problematic, as you've done. We are at a disadvantage here because we don't have present the people who came up with that idea and decided to execute it. And I do think that's important to give us pause, because the issue of commemoration, which is an important ethical distinction. Are we simulating something to understand it, or are we commemorating it, or are we glorifying it, or are we valorizing it? There's a big ethical difference there. The problem for me is that there's a lot of eye of the beholder judgment in that. And what may seem commemorative to you might seem like immersion in a simulation for purpose of better understanding to me. I don't know that that's true about this medal, this marketing act that is separate from the game design. But in general, if we're concerned with commemoration, it's really good to get whatever information we can about why did the originator do what they were doing, and did they think they achieved it. So just I'm just sort of thinking, you know, it would be good to know more about the publisher, NAC Wargames, and what they had in mind here, and did it work for them?
So I do not have a statement from NAC Wargames, and unfortunately, I must say that the public statements they made online were pretty bad, in the sense that they were not even acknowledging the fact that they were giving it at Essen when the picture was taken at Essen. We're not acknowledging that it was a Nazi Iron Cross, even though it was a Nazi era Iron Cross. So they've had a very coy response to it, not really owning up to it, which is something that we've seen from that publisher in the past on other topics, which also raises the question about their seriousness. That being said, because we had discussions with Carlos ahead of time, I do have a statement from Carlos specifically regarding the medal, and I think I would like to read it because it would be fair to him to also have at least a bit of his voice here, because he's directly concerned. And he said to me, the token of German army memorabilia given to backers of the game has no bearing on its topic or its treatment of the clean Wehrmacht myth. One of the main design goals of the game was to debunk this enduring, insidious myth. Indeed, the goal is an integral part of the game's mechanics and narrative, as anyone who has actually played it can attest to. So I think we can make a clear distinction between what Carlos was trying to achieve with his design and the medal, and I think I am not sure how comfortable he is himself with the medal. He defended it online as, quote unquote, an innocent souvenir, which also created some reactions, because it's like, it doesn't look that innocent, Carlos. So, but he's probably also in a weird position. I'm not sure how much of control he has over this. There is always distinction between what the designer does and what the publisher decides to do. But I think the discussion of the publisher is also probably something that needs to be discussed. Has been highlighted online that a game on 1945 Germany was promoted by one of its designers using Joseph Goebbels' little memes on Facebook. They are also known for distributing Nazi memorabilia from the Azul division on their platform. So I think there is maybe a more general discussion to be had regarding NAC Wargames. They're not here. I don't think it's maybe the place to discuss this, but I think it's within a context that doesn't look great in terms of optics, and I think there is concerns that are fair to have. But yeah, I think it's a good point. But going back to Carlos' statement, Carlos says that, and maybe that would be probably the final stretch of the discussion, because I want to open up discussing the game itself just a bit, because I haven't played it yet, and I'm planning on playing it actually and potentially reviewing it. But Carlos says that the goal, the main goal of the design, is to debunk the myth, and he says that anyone who played it can attest to. And I think, Jan, here you have maybe an interesting point of view regarding the game that you have played, and what is your opinion on the way it is actually approaching the clean Wehrmacht myth, in the sense that this is very relevant to our discussion, because compared to other games, this is not about kinetic warfare. It is strategic level. It talks about economy. It talks about strategy, politics. So we're really deep into how the Wehrmacht is being represented there. And I was curious to hear your opinions, Jan, and then I will give it back to you, Volko, because you've also played the game and you've read a lengthy article about it. And I think it would be interesting to contrast and compare the perspectives.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are at 60 minutes. So if we're going to continue, I'm going to need to at least briefly drop off, and I will try to rejoin if that works, because I've got
let's maybe
4 p.m.
take,
right now.
Yeah, sure. We can. So how long do you need, Volko?
Well, 5 minutes to determine whether It's a connectivity issue
Okay,
in my
but then-
household, and if everything is fine, I would come back, and if it's not, then I won't be able to rejoin.
Then we'll wrap it up. Okay, good. But thanks, Volko. We hope that you'll come back, and Jan, we can go to you now.
Right. So, first of all, I also have to thank Carlos, because he, in the preparation of our discussion today, he wrote a considerable lengthy response to a number of questions I had concerning the game. And those align with what he has been saying online before on BGG, for example, which is a very, very clear design approach or goal, let's say, that he's trying, as you mentioned, trying to debunk the myth, trying to focus on the infighting, if you want, of the Wehrmacht elite. And I'm not sure from my experience, and I'm very curious, and hopefully Volko will be able to join us again to give us his opinion on that the mechanics necessarily achieve that goal. It's a bit hard to argue about that right now, because most of the audience and most on the panel haven't played the game. So that's a difficult thing to make an argument that's not provable. But what concerns me the most is, so there are the different factions within the Wehrmacht, right? So players are playing different factions with different goals. Some are sort of the fanatic Nazis, some are the military old guard, some are professional militaries, and some are dissidents. And they have different goals they want to achieve, and ultimately, as the game will lead to the downfall of the Third Reich, they might get involved in one way or another in trying to actually kill Hitler. The main concern I have is so that for me, having played this several times, the mechanics don't convey that there's more going on than actual fighting and sort of disagreement about competences and who should be in charge and so forth. There are a few, very limited number of events that mention like shooting civilians, shooting prisoners of war, and those kind of things. Let's say about 5 cards in the game. But none of the cards give any contextualization to that. I'm not quite sure if the game comes with a playbook that contextualizes any of that. I haven't seen anything about historical contextualization in the rulebook, actually.
It hasn't been publicly released, but I think that Volko had access to an early version of it.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to know indeed. And so it doesn't, within the game and sort of the model the game presents, most of the crimes against humanity we've heard about in the beginning of the live stream are not mentioned at all. They don't have any effect on what the players are doing. And thereby, I mean, at the same time, all the cards have nice little pictures of Nazi generals, right? Some even showing very clearly the insignia and so forth. And what my impression is from playing the game is, because there are these factions, and that sort of, from my perspective, aligns with the clean Wehrmacht myth in some sense, as the Wehrmacht generals interviewed by Bertil Hart, for example, pointed out that, well, there were some of those fascists around the Führer, but everybody else really was. We were just soldiers, or we were against the Führer. Look at Stauffenberg; we even tried to kill him, which is absurd if you look at the historical sources. So this aspect missing is probably, for me, the crucial aspect where the goal of the game isn't achieved by how the mechanics display the period. But now I'm very curious to hear what Volko thinks about that.
Yeah, so Volko is back. So Volko, you have maybe you had this long article that is linked in the description, where you talk about the game, but maybe so people can go and read this. I think it is very well put together, and it shows a really interesting overview of the game. And when I read it, I must say I was really reassured in the way it was approaching it, and I was actually eager to play it, and I still am today. It's just that I've been pretty set aback by this memorabilia thing, but that's another topic for discussion. But regarding specifically what Jan is mentioning, the fact that you have those factions that are represented that seems to say that not all of them were in favor of the Nazi political objective, and it doesn't really show in any meaningful way the war crimes that were made. And from what I could glance over, it feels like it's not really showing a lot of the violent resource extraction on the West Front, the way the prisoners of war were used to actually support the war effort. It looks like it's at least glossed over or very much abstracted. What was your perception, Volko, from the game?
Yeah, I would not say that it's glossed over or abstracted. Forced labor is an explicit card actually in the game. So I set my expectations relative to what is the scope of the game, what's the purpose of the model, and relative to what other games we have that deal with the German high command in the European war. And to my knowledge of the genre, Other Side of the Hill does much more than any other to cover the fact that almost the entire high command was fully behind the Nazis, but there were some who did it out of ideological. Now, I'm not an expert on this. This is the premise of the game as it is, but that what it shows is, or what it purports is, that many of these generals were doing it out of ideological fanaticism. Some of these generals were doing it out of a belief in a modern professional army, and some of them out of old Prussian tradition, and some of them, in fact, were dissidents who actually acted against that. And in the game, the players end up explicitly representing those various ideologies, and it very much affects the player experience because it's part of the victory conditions. And as a game designer, I will tell you that the rules text that most influences what players will do, how they will act and decide, and therefore their experience of the game is how to win. And in Other Side of the Hill, you win ultimately through politics in the competitive version of the game. That is prestige, bureaucratic politics against other generals, and ideology and hidden agendas, ideological politics. And the identities of the assignments of the generals to these various ideological positions are historical by the designer's best judgment. And there are design notes, and there is context. There is a playbook with several pages of design notes, and I've got some excerpts of that. If you don't, want to, take the game, I've got some excerpts of that in that article that you mentioned. And I fear that to judge otherwise about this is missing or that is not given enough context falls into a trap if we're not doing that relative to the genre as a whole. And what does this particular work do to advance the ball on our understanding of the politics going on within the Wehrmacht? And for what it's worth, the design notes are quite, I'm sure, appropriately critical of the population of German generals as a whole, and where they stood morally. the hole that we can fall into logically is, damning a design, a game model for what it includes, and then damning it for what it fails to include. If we say, well, we want to be accurate, but we don't want you to show the symbols that these people actually wore, we want to immerse you into that situation to better understand it, but we don't want to show you what the people look like. And then at the same time say, but you didn't show us this, and you didn't show us that, and you didn't put in enough pictures that are unpleasant to look at. It puts game designers in a position where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They're either, whitewashing by leaving too much out, or they're, offending people by putting some things in and including some things in their model. So if I am conscious of that and I compare this design to, name me an ETO, a European theater of war game at the continental level that does anything close to as much to show the fact that much of the German high command were Nazis and even Nazi fanatics, then I might change my appraisal.
Can I just really jump in really quickly to say that
Yeah.
the description that Volko just gave of how the German generals are depicted in the game, right? And again, I haven't played it, but I did read the sort of winning conditions thing on the website. Is perhaps the clearest actual example of the clean Wehrmacht myth, because it's just fundamentally untrue. This idea of the German general who is the Prussian professional it's bullshit. It's absolute historical bullshit. Yes, there were those who were Prussians, but they were also ideologically, by and large, the great number of them were completely aligned with the Nazis. They were taking literal bribes from Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not. I'm not attacking Volko at all here. If that's how the game designer is presenting these sort of dissident generals who ironically only begin to show themselves when the war effort is going poorly in the first place. That in and of itself, for better or for worse, and I'm not making a judgment about all the issues about designing games, etc., but if that is the way they're being depicted in this addition to the game, then it's 1000% a reification of the clean Wehrmacht myth. The idea of dissident Wehrmacht generals is almost a myth in of itself. And even the July 20th generals, you had Einsatzgruppen commanders who were part of the July 20th movement, right? The general in charge of murdering 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war was a July 20th dissident general. So, it's not historical. It's not historical, and it is actually, if that's the portrayal, it is fundamentally amplifying this idea of the clean Wehrmacht and this idea that you can pick and choose, and if you squint just right at the Wehrmacht, you can see some really good, actual honorable guys in there who didn't really like what Hitler was doing, and fundamentally, that's just not the case.
So if I don't think that's a fair characterization of what's either in the game or in Carlos's design notes. So it may simply be that I'm a poor, translator in how I put it, because I don't think it's a matter of these were good guys. I don't know that Carlos ever says that. What he says is that those that he depicts as dissidents were well, I'll just read you exactly what he says. The dissidents are all generals executed or incarcerated for their opposition to the Nazi regime. And the other ones, the ones who are, whatever, they might or might not, old guard and professionals would deny Hitler Nazism after the war, despite benefiting from the regime and lacking the moral fiber to act against it. This is from the design notes of the game. The sympathizers group presents generals identified with Nazism. Most generals directly responsible for war crimes are included in this group. It is important to stress the directly responsible part. If all generals who condoned or looked away from war crimes were assigned to the sympathizers group, precious few would fall out of this category. So the general sense that I get when I read the context that the designer gives is it's quite a healthy dose of condemnation. But the point is that differences within made a difference to the conduct of the war. That may be true or false, I don't know, but that is the premise of the model, not that hey, there's some good chaps here.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I mean, but what I'm saying is that that depiction, in light of the larger memory of the war and the myth itself, is actually really still reifying that. And again, I mean, and this could be a criticism that I may have of just the idea in general of playing it, because ultimately, whenever you play a game, I mean, arguably you want to win, and so ultimately you're still trying to take one of these generals and win with them. And I would contend that frankly it's inappropriate at some level to have that kind of a gaming system. And again, I mean, let me be clear, I'm a nerdy academic and I study this and I write books about it, and I don't expect that everyone has the level of knowledge that I do or even should. I mean, I don't know how to design a game. It's wizardry to me when I play a board game. I'm like, how did someone come up with this? It's amazing. So I'm not critiquing that either. I'm just suggesting, and I think maybe my larger sort of warning in general is just to think about how these portrayals, because board games, video games are also a cultural production, and they teach those of us that play it something about the history. Whether or not that's their intent, it's what happens. And so I think it's important that these considerations are raised. And I don't think we should ever feel comfortable trying to sort of get the Nazis to win without really having some serious reservations about it. And again, I'm not trying to be the pessimist here, and I'm certainly not attacking Volko or necessarily what College is trying to do. I'm just trying to point out that even subconsciously or just implicitly, this clean Wehrmacht thing is, I mean, I'll be honest, it's really hard to kill this myth. This has been going on 80 years now, and it's still out there, and there are important people and intelligent people who still think it's a thing. So the fact that games are picking this up is not a criticism necessarily of like the gaming world at all. I hope that makes sense. I'm not trying to be a jerk. Just it's
no, it makes sense, and I think it opens up to maybe the final point, and we're going to go very fast on it. And I want to go back to you, Alastair, because you were on the receiving end of the community's reaction, and that's the last point that I want to mention. Like just the fact that people are asking questions, interrogating, examining. Some people have knee-jerk reactions around, oh no, it wasn't a Nazi medal, like denying the obvious facts or stuff like this, or it's just a game, or let us enjoy our stuff, please. And sometimes I would say outraged tourists or also were involved. So people who have nothing to do with wargaming coming in, writing people up, explaining that people asking questions were liberal cocks and stuff like this, and that we shouldn't even discuss those things. I was wondering, so Alastair, what was your reaction to all of this, and how do you feel it says something about what do you feel it says about the community, and maybe what is the way forward for us to be able to have those discussions in a good in a fruitful way?
Yeah, thanks. No, that was definitely sort of Friday night, the sort of things appearing out of Essen and comments, and then immediately Twitter being what it is, it attracts these sort of comments. But I think there's sort of a lot going on in that sort of space. But I think there's some important things to sort of tease out of it. And I think going back to the sort of initial question that got posed by someone, to which I responded, was is this weird? And the answer is yeah, that's kind of weird in the context of promoting a game as the medal. And I think some of my sort of initial reaction was I had already been a bit wary about the game, having not played it. I had read Volko's review on the Board Games Chronicle, I guess sort of quasi review. Which certainly I think, and Dan Thoreau's mentioned this in the chat, I'm actually quite intrigued by this as a game and as something to sort of pick through. And I think one of the important things I think in the war game space is that we are having conversations about these things, and we are able to say that, well, it's not all necessarily black and white. And sure, if you don't want to ever play games that have Nazis in them, that's fine. That's your prerogative. If you want to tell me, leave me alone, I want my panzers, I like them, and I want tank battles on the Eastern Front, and I'm going to ignore all of the problematic elements. Sure, exactly. Do that. But at the same time, I think accept that wargaming is becoming an increasingly broad church, and becoming increasing in its appeal. And I think we are moving forwards from some of the sort of older hex and counter stuff into things that have a lot more variety. And actually, in many ways, as I look at the other side of the hill, the game that it kind of strikes me that also came out recently that it looks a little similar to is Mr. President. That came out from GMT, which sort of a monster solo game, so a little bit difficult, but you're trying to navigate certain things. And I think actually, there is a lot of space for people to put models out, and Cole Worley's been very clear about the way that a game is part of a discussion, and to open up a discussion space there for people to play it and people to talk about it, for people to say there are things here that I think are problematic. And to speak to Waitman's point about being a nerdy academic, I mean, yes, me too. And I think about all of these things, but the practice of history is, for want of a better sort of analogy, essentially a discussion. Where we're creating arguments and we're writing books and articles that are advancing arguments based on evidence. And yes, sometimes those can be very skewed in certain directions, and we kind of pick our topics and get into things. But I think games are doing that too, and I think that's where they have a kind of a space in educational contexts and within that discussion. And so I think this game, it's got a lot. There's a lot there, I think, to look at. I think, like others here in the chat, I would like to play it and lay my hands on a copy and unpick it. It is kind of unfair, I think, to take something apart that you haven't actually seen or read. I think there is that would be kind of bad practice as an academic from my point of view to start trashing a book I hadn't read unless we already had an established sort of sense of it. And for that reason, I often tell students to read very bad books. But I think there is, Carlos has been quite clear, and I've seen a lot of comments privately from Carlos. I think it's clear what Carlos was trying to do with this. I guess the question is whether he did it or not is something we sort of have yet to see. And I, it's important that post-publication things take on a bit of a life of their own as well. And I think trying to unpick this. I think it is kind of crucial, though, and I think the reason we're here is that we do need to talk about the things that are difficult, and actually kind of shying away from difficult topics and difficult conversations in wargaming doesn't help us fix the things that are problems, and doesn't help us say, well, actually, maybe this game is making a kind of argument in a direction that I feel is problematic. That the game is engaging with the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. It's the designer says he's trying to dispel it, but is he really sensibly doing that? Is he handling the topic sensibly? And I think World War II is one of these things where we hear designers talk about how they've approached things as well. David Thompson has been very clear about his approach with Undaunted Normandy, about how he didn't want people sort of identifying with the German side. He wanted people to get invested in the narrative of the American side rather than the Germans. And I think that kind of, I'll round out by, thinking about where games ask players to play roles, and where just because you play a role doesn't mean you have to sympathize with everything involved in that role. In some ways you're playing a character, and there is actually a great deal we can learn about things by playing something we don't identify with, by interrogating what are the motivations here, what's going on. Games give us actually quite a good space to do that, for us to say, now I understand how that happens. I wouldn't do that personally in my life, but I can understand how we got there. And I think that there is a space here for this. And I think I would really like this sort of discussion to continue, once people have got their hands on the game and been able to play it, I think there are legitimate concerns here around a difficult topic. But I think how we got here was a very questionable promotional gift, which was, I think, suggested some things about the game design which may or may not be true, and which seems to be more driven by a publisher perhaps than by a designer. But I think the promotional gift was weird. The game, I think, is still something we can talk about.
That was a great summation.
I think, yeah, we are 25 minutes beyond what we originally planned for. So, as you said, Alastair, I think it's probably a discussion worth continuing in the future. What I suggest is that I know that personally I'm going to play the game. I know that Dan Tio was in the chat talking about it. Dan, I would be happy to play it with you. That could be a fun stream. If any one of you in the panel wants to join us, I think that would be really good, and we could actually explore and engage with the game. And whether or not you play it, Waitman, I will still reach out to you, talk about the things that I've seen in the game, pick your brain, and figure out what you think based on your work, what you think about it, and how to perceive it, and we will keep on this discussion. I think there is a wider discussion to be had regarding clean Wehrmacht and wargaming in general, and I think that's probably something that I've been wanting to explore for a while, to look through the Eastern Front games chronologically, depending on the date of release, and see how perceptions have evolved. But if you're interested in this kind of approach, I would like to highlight one podcast that is being published by the Homo Ludens Extended Universe, which is We Intend to Move on Your Works, that is looking at American Civil War depiction in war games, and explore the Lost Cause myth, another myth that permeates within a specific history, and how it is being addressed. So I would really recommend to have a listen at that, while maybe one day releasing something on the Eastern Front in the future. I would like to thank everyone for being here. Massive thanks to the mods, because they've done a lot of work, just making sure that the discussion stayed civil. Most of the discussion were great. There was a lot of very interesting interactions. A lot of really cool people were there. It was nice to see a lot of friends of the show, so that was really great. I want to thank our guests for being here, engaging, discussing, and having a very civil and informative discussion that was really, really awesome. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't know if any of you has any last thoughts they would like to share before we conclude the stream, but I would say that I was very, very happy with this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Fred, for drawing us together for this.
Yeah, and also thanks for having me. And I also
welcome.
want to point out that it is great that we're having the conversation. Just having the conversation means that we're, everybody here is kind of on the right side. I mean, it's the people that sort of aren't having this conversation, and don't even think about the potential issues, I think, are the ones that we should kind of be worried about. But thanks for having me, and thanks so much. It was great meeting everybody on the panel as well.
Awesome. Great. But thanks, everyone. This concludes the stream. Have a great evening, everyone. Now I'm going to get some sleep because my voice is collapsing. So I need to sleep. Thanks, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.